Stop what you are doing right now. Seriously, whatever tab you have open, whatever conversation you're half paying attention to, whatever background noise you've got running while you scroll, close it. Because what is happening with the Cleveland Browns in the last 48 hours is not something you want to catch up on later through a highlight reel or a two-sentence tweet. This is the kind of story that requires your full attention, because if you blink, you're going to miss the exact moment that a franchise that has been wandering in the dark for decades finally found the light switch. And I know how that sounds. I know that sentence has been written about Cleveland before. I know that fans of this team have been handed reasons to believe and watched those reasons dissolve before the leaves even changed color. I know the pattern. I've lived the pattern. You get excited in the spring, you start dreaming in training camp, and then somewhere between week 4 and week 8, the whole thing unravels in a way that feels almost deliberately cruel, like the football gods specifically chose Cleveland as the place where hope goes to sit in a corner and think about what it did wrong. But this is different, and I am not saying that the way a desperate fan says it to convince himself. I'm saying it the way someone says it when they've actually looked at the information, laid the pieces out side by side, and realized that the picture forming in front of them doesn't look like anything this franchise has assembled in the modern era. The texture of this moment is different. The energy coming out of that building is different. And if you give me your time for the next several minutes, I am going to walk you through every single layer of what's being built in Cleveland right now and explain exactly why the people who are sleeping on this team are going to be very, very uncomfortable by the time January rolls around. Let's get into it. The first thing you need to understand, the foundational piece that everything else in this story rests on, is what happened with Todd Monken in the quarterback decision. Because when this information started leaking out of Cleveland, the reaction in most NFL circles was a shrug. Another coach saying another thing about another young quarterback in another offseason that looks identical to every offseason before it. Same movie, different cast. File it under noise and move on. Except, this is not noise. What is being reported and what sources close to the organization are clearly communicating to people paying attention is that Monken has made his decision, not quietly, not tentatively, not in the way coaches hedge when they want to keep competition alive for the cameras. He has made his decision with the kind of conviction that doesn't leave room for reinterpretation. Shedeur Sanders is the quarterback of the Cleveland Browns, not conditionally, not pending a training camp performance review, not subject to revision if the first 2 preseason games go sideways. The decision has been made, the direction has been set, and now the entire operation is moving in alignment behind it. That last part is the part most people outside of football buildings completely miss. When a head coach stops hedging and starts committing, the organization doesn't just follow his words, it follows his energy. The offensive coordinator starts scripting the first 15 plays around that quarterback's strength specifically. The receivers start running routes built for that quarterback's timing and eye level. The offensive linemen are coached with that quarterback's movement patterns in mind. The entire system orients itself like a compass needle toward true north. And in this case, true north has a name. It wears number 2, and for the first time in what feels like a franchise lifetime, the whole machine is pointing the same direction. Now contrast that with where things stood just weeks ago, because the contrast is important. The public framing just weeks before these reports came out was still the language of competition. Best man wins, open audition, fair process. All the language coaches used when they haven't fully committed, when they're leaving themselves an exit ramp, when they're managing expectations rather than setting a vision. That framing had a lot of people assuming Shedeur's hold on the starting job was tenuous, that Monken was genuinely undecided, that the outcome was legitimately uncertain heading into camp.
What we now know is that the internal reality had already moved far beyond that. The public was still watching the competition narrative play out, while inside the building, the coaches were already working as though the decision had been finalized. That gap between the public story and the internal truth is actually one of the most revealing things about how serious this commitment already is. They weren't making noise about Shedeur because they needed to sell it. They were quietly building around him because they already knew, and when you know, you build. And what they're building is something worth paying close attention to. Think about what this means specifically for Shedeur Sanders as a player and as a person, because this is where the story gets genuinely interesting from a development standpoint, not just a roster construction standpoint. There is a version of being a young quarterback in the NFL that is almost designed to prevent growth. You come in with talent, with preparation, with everything you've built your whole life around football. And then the environment you walk into is one of constant evaluation, quiet skepticism, open competition framing that keeps you aware at all times that your coaches haven't fully decided on you. Every throw you make in practice is a test. Every bad decision in a film session is a data point against you. Every time you watch the game from the bench, you're wondering whether the guy next to you is being considered as a serious alternative. That mental environment doesn't produce growth, it produces caution. It produces a quarterback who is managing risk instead of making plays, and managed risk does not win football games in the NFL. The version Shedeur Sanders is now walking into is fundamentally different from that. Monken has been in the building with him. He's not operating on scouting report impressions or combine metrics or draft evaluation language. He's watched Shedeur process NFL-level information in real time. He's seen how Shedeur responds when the coaching gets harder and more detailed. He's watched how Shedeur handles the moments when the play breaks down and improvisation is required. He's observed how the quarterback handles the mental and emotional weight of being in an organization with enormous expectations and a fan base that has been starved for a real answer at this position for so long that the hunger has turned into something almost painful. And what Monken has seen has convinced him, not persuaded him, convinced him. That is a different level of certainty, and it produces a different level of investment from a coaching staff. When Shedeur Sanders walks into that huddle, knowing his head coach is not evaluating him, knowing the man designing the offense built it specifically for his skill set, knowing the entire organization is pulling behind him rather than running a quiet parallel assessment of whether someone else might be better, that changes everything about how he plays. The difference between a quarterback who is trying to keep his job and a quarterback who is trying to win games is enormous. One plays not to fail, the other plays to win. And the great ones, the ones that end up with rings and legacies, they play to win from the very beginning because the environment they're in gave them permission to do that. Cleveland is giving Shedeur Sanders permission to play to win, and that might be the most important gift this organization has ever given a quarterback. There is also the element of Monken's specific coaching style and what it unlocks in a quarterback with Shedeur's particular skill set. Monken is not a one-size-fits-all offensive mind. He adapts his system to the talent he has available, rather than forcing talent into a predetermined mold and wondering why it doesn't fit. What he has seen in Shedeur is a quarterback who processes information quickly, who has elite-level pocket awareness for someone his age, who understands how to manipulate a defense's eyes before the ball is snapped, and who has the arm talent to attack every level of the field when the protection holds up. Those attributes, when you build a system specifically to highlight them rather than work around them, become something an opposing defensive coordinator has nightmares about on Sunday morning. The coach-quarterback partnership that Monken and Shedeur appear to be forming is genuinely rare. It is not something that can be manufactured through front office transactions or produced through careful roster management. It exists or it doesn't. It's built on a specific kind of mutual understanding and respect that either develops between two people or it never does. The greatest quarterback runs in NFL history, the ones that define franchises and eras, almost always trace back to a coach-quarterback relationship that had this quality. The ability to communicate on a level that goes beyond scheme and X's and O's into something deeper. A shared understanding of what this offense is trying to do and a shared belief that this quarterback is the one who can do it. Cleveland appears to have found it. And that, by itself, changes everything. Now, let's talk about Deshaun Watson, because this part of the story is genuinely fascinating, and it's being talked about in ways that completely miss the point. The surface-level reaction to Watson becoming a backup is predictable. There are people out there treating it as some kind of embarrassment, or as evidence that Watson is finished as a relevant NFL figure. And look, the discourse around Watson has been complicated and charged for a long time, for reasons that exist outside the football conversation entirely. But if we're purely talking about football and what Watson's presence in this building means for Shedeur Sanders and for the Cleveland Browns as an organization, the narrative that Watson is backup is somehow a sad or irrelevant outcome is completely wrong. What Watson still carries inside him is not something that goes away when your starting job does. He still has elite-level football intelligence, built over years of playing the position at the highest level in the world's most competitive football league. He still knows how to read a defense, not in a general way, not in a textbook way, but in the lived real time, this is what it actually feels like when a safety is rotating before the snap way that only comes from having been in those moments hundreds of times under actual game conditions. He knows how to manage the mental load of being a professional quarterback in a league that is constantly, relentlessly, specifically trying to expose your weaknesses and punish you for them. That knowledge, that lived experience, does not disappear when you move from the first string to the second string. It just changes who it benefits most. And here is the piece that makes Watson's role potentially extraordinary rather than just functional. Shedeur Sanders is 22 or 23 years old and is beginning his NFL career with enormous expectations and the weight of a fan base's hope on his shoulders. That is a particular kind of pressure that is difficult to prepare for, no matter how well coached and mentally strong you are. It is different from college pressure. It is different from the pre-draft process pressure. It is the pressure of standing in an NFL huddle on a Sunday afternoon in front of 70,000 people who have been waiting for you specifically, knowing that the entire league is studying your tendencies, your weaknesses, the exact leverage points they can attack to make you fail. Having someone standing next to you who has already been through that fire, who has stood in that specific crucible and knows what it feels like from the inside is invaluable. Not just the knowledge Watson can share in film sessions, or the observations he can offer on the sideline during a game when Shedeur comes off the field and needs 2 minutes of clarity before going back out. It's also the simple psychological reassurance of being near someone who has been where you're trying to go and made it there. That changes how a young player carries himself when things get hard, and in an NFL season, things always get hard. Now, the question that always follows this kind of discussion is the ego question, because Watson came to Cleveland as a franchise quarterback. He was brought in with a fully guaranteed contract that represented one of the largest financial commitments in NFL history. He has operated at the highest level of this profession for his entire career. The psychological distance from that version of himself to the version that is now wearing a backup number and whose primary job is to develop someone else, that distance is real, and bridging it is not a small thing. But if the reporting is accurate, and it increasingly appears that it is, someone already had that conversation with Watson. Someone sat across from him and laid out the new reality clearly and honestly and made a compelling enough case that Watson bought in. And if Watson has genuinely bought in, not just said the right things for the cameras, but actually internalized his new role and decided to pour himself into it, then what the Cleveland Browns have at the backup quarterback position is arguably the most unique and valuable backup quarterback situation in the entire league. Not because of what Watson can do on the field anymore, but because of everything he can pour into the guy standing in front of him. Used properly, Deshaun Watson could be one of the most important factors in Shedeur Sanders' development, and that is a sentence anyone predicted writing this time last year. Let's shift over to Dillon Gabriel, because this situation has been playing out quietly, and the resolution of it tells you a lot about how focused and clear-eyed this organization is being about what it needs right now. Gabriel came to Cleveland with genuine competitive fire. He didn't arrive as someone content to be a depth piece or a practice arm. He came in believing he deserved a real look, a legitimate chance, a spot in the conversation, and you cannot blame him for that. Competitive fire is one of the things you want in every player in that building. The willingness to fight for your opportunity rather than accept whatever role is handed to you is a quality that coaches preach and organizations say they value.
But there's a version of competitive fire that serves the team and a version that creates friction. And when the hierarchy at a position has been clearly and definitively established, a talented player who feels he was overlooked sitting in that environment doesn't serve the team. It creates noise. It creates low-level tension that doesn't manifest in any obvious single incident, but exists as a persistent undercurrent in every meeting room, every film session, every practice rep where he's watching the guy who got the job he wanted from behind. That kind of ambient friction is invisible from the outside and corrosive from the inside. Trading Gabriel isn't a move against him. It's actually the right call for everybody involved. Gabriel gets what he actually needs, which is a clean slate somewhere with a genuinely open competition, where he can walk in without the shadow of a more high-profile situation hanging over everything he does. He gets to be evaluated purely on what he puts on the field, rather than in the context of a room that has already moved past the question he was hoping to answer. For a player with his talent and his drive, that matters enormously. Somewhere, there's a coaching staff that is going to get a motivated, talented, hungry quarterback who has a point to prove, and that player is going to make that team glad he arrived. For Cleveland, the benefit is just as real, because what this franchise cannot afford heading into this season with legitimate ambitions for the first time in recent memory is a QB room with competing internal narratives. The worst thing that could happen to Shedeur Sanders' development right now isn't a bad game, or a rough stretch, or a tough loss on a cold Sunday in November. The worst thing is an environment where the focus is divided, where there's a subplot running alongside the main story, where every narrative about the starting quarterback shares space with questions about whether someone else in the building might have been the better choice. Removing Gabriel removes that possibility entirely. The room is clean now. The message is clear. There is one quarterback, one direction, one story to tell. And in a building that is trying to build something real for the first time in a very long time, that clarity is not a minor thing. It is the foundation everything else gets poured on top of. Clean break, smart football, move forward. Now here's the piece of this puzzle that I genuinely think is being slept on by most of the people talking about this team right now, and I want to give it the attention it deserves, because it's not flashy and it doesn't have a famous name attached to it, but it might be the most important long-term investment the organization has made: the 2026 draft class. Cleveland spent real, meaningful draft capital this offseason on players whose specific job is to protect Shedeur Sanders and build a functional, dynamic infrastructure around him. Offensive linemen, guys with athleticism and power, and the kind of pass protection technique that young quarterbacks need to develop without getting beaten up before they ever establish their rhythm, their timing, their feel for how they want to run an NFL offense. And I want you to think about what that investment communicates beyond the picks themselves. You don't build an offensive line for a quarterback you're unsure of. That's the whole sentence. Read it again. When a front office decides to spend draft capital, real capital, assets that cost real resources to acquire and that represent real opportunity cost because you can't spend the same pick twice on protecting a specific quarterback, they're making a statement that is louder than anyone in that building can say publicly. They're putting their resources where their conviction is. They're saying that the person under center is the person who is going to be under center for years, not just for the next few months. And the organization's job is to build an environment where that quarterback can succeed, not just survive. That is not hedging. That is not the behavior of a front office that is still running an open audition at quarterback. That is a front office that has seen enough, decided enough, and committed enough to start building for the specific player they believe in. Those draft picks said something. They said Shedeur Sanders is the answer, and our job from this point forward is to build the question that fits that answer. Think about what this means for Shedeur's first several starts as a professional.
There is a version of being a young quarterback in the NFL where the line in front of you is adequate at best and the pass protection is inconsistent, so you're getting hit regularly before your mechanics are settled, before your feel for the pocket is fully developed, before you've built the timing with your receivers that allows you to anticipate their breaks rather than wait to see them. That version produces quarterbacks who learn to flinch before the ball is out of their hand, who start making decisions based on pressure rather than reads, whose development slows because the environment keeps interrupting the growth process.
The new linemen coming into Cleveland are going to give Shedeur something different from that. They're going to give him actual time in the pocket, real time, the kind of time where you can go through your full progression, where you can wait for the second or third option to come open instead of dumping the ball immediately to avoid the hit, where you can build the trusting repetitions with your receivers that eventually turn into the kind of chemistry that defenses can't take away. That time transforms promising reps into reliable production, and reliable production, accumulated over the course of a season in a functional offensive environment, is how a young quarterback transitions from a prospect into a problem. The front office saw that vision. They believed in it enough to spend real assets on it, and the bet on the table is that Shedeur Sanders, given that environment, given that time, given that protection, grows into something that makes that investment look prescient. I believe they're right, and we're going to find out together. Now let's get to the wide receiver debate, because this is where the conversation gets loudest and most heated, and I want to handle it properly rather than just throwing out names and watching the takes fly. Tyreek Hill and Amon-Ra St. Brown are both reportedly in the mix for Cleveland's receiver room, and if you follow this league at all, you already know what both of those names mean. You already know the conversation that exists around each of them. But let's actually get into the substance of it rather than just naming names, because the choice between these two players is not just a talent evaluation, it's a philosophical question about what Cleveland is building and who that building process is meant to serve. Tyreek Hill first, because the case for him is the loudest case, and it deserves a serious hearing. He is one of the most electric playmakers in the entire history of the National Football League. Not this era, not his draft class, the entire history of the league. His speed is the kind that breaks coverage schemes that are theoretically designed to contain it. His ability to take a 5-yard catch in the flat and turn it into a 50-yard nightmare for a defense before anyone in the stadium has fully processed what happened is not something that can be schemed away or coached around. It exists on a level that is genuinely unfair to the people trying to stop it. And here is the thing about what a player like Tyreek Hill does that doesn't always show up in his stat line on any specific play. His presence on the field changes what a defense is able to do to every other player on that offense. When you have a receiver that a defensive coordinator is truly terrified of, not concerned about, not game planning for, but genuinely terrified of in the way that costs him sleep on Saturday night, that receiver commands attention on every single snap, regardless of whether the ball is going his way. A corner who knows Hill is lined up 5 yards to his left is not playing his natural game. A safety who knows Hill is in the pattern is not flying downhill the way he wants to. A linebacker who knows there's a jet sweep threat on any given play is not crashing as hard as he should on rundowns. That attention, that diversion of defensive resources away from what they actually want to do, creates real operational space for every other player on that offense. A quarterback with Hill in the game has options that literally don't exist otherwise. That case is real. It's not hype, it's just football reality. But here is where I come down on this, and I want to be completely honest that what follows is my genuine evaluation and not just reporting. When you put the Tyreek Hill argument next to the Amon-Ra St. Brown argument in the specific context of what Shedeur Sanders needs in his first year running an NFL offense, I think the case for St. Brown is actually stronger, and not slightly stronger, meaningfully stronger. Here's why. Amon-Ra St. Brown is one of the most technically sound route revers in the National Football League, and I don't mean that in the way people sometimes say technically sound as a polite way of saying a player isn't athletic enough to win other ways. I mean it in the way that matters at the highest level of professional football.
His understanding of leverage, his ability to read defensive tendencies before the snap and adjust his release and route accordingly, his comprehension of how to create separation through craft and intelligence rather than just raw speed. These are elite-level skills that translate across every game plan, every weather condition, every defensive scheme a coordinator can throw at him. And what that means for a young quarterback is something that goes beyond any single play or any single game. It means predictability in the best possible sense. When Shedeur Sanders lines up in a big moment, in a third down situation, in a 2-minute drill, in a fourth quarter when the pressure is real and everything matters, he can look at Amon-Ra St. Brown on his route and know, not hope, not project, know that the separation will be there because St. Brown creates it reliably, consistently, on schedule every single time he runs that route, regardless of who is covering him. That certainty, that absolute trust in where your receiver is going to be when you release the ball is one of the most developmentally important things a young quarterback can have. The great quarterbacks talk about this constantly when they look back on what made their early development work. The receivers who showed up where they were supposed to be, the ones who ran routes on time rather than improvising, the ones whose destination you could feel in your fingertips when you started your throwing motion before you could even fully see the separation because the trust was already built. Amon-Ra St. Brown is that receiver. He is the receiver you throw to because you know, and because that knowing builds a confidence that compounds over the course of a season into something that eventually becomes automatic. That consistent consistency is worth more in year one of a new era than the occasional explosive play that a good defense can also sometimes take away. Tyreek Hill's ceiling on any given play might be higher than just about anyone else in this conversation. One deep ball, one blown assignment by a corner who was supposed to have help and didn't, and the scoreboard changes in an instant. That is absolutely real and absolutely valuable. But for a young quarterback who is simultaneously building his game, building his confidence, building his relationship with his offense, his coaches, and the system he's running, I will take the consistent, reliable, technically elite receiver who shows up on schedule every single time, every single day of the week. Build the foundation first, establish the timing. Let Shedeur find his rhythm in a real game environment with a receiver who makes his job easier rather than more complicated. The explosiveness, the big plays, the moments that make people in the stands drop their food, those will come once the foundation is there. Because a quarterback who trusts his reads, who knows his receiver, who has developed real operational confidence in his system, will eventually make explosive plays with any receiver on his roster. Give Cleveland Amon-Ra St. Brown. Build the bridge, and then watch what happens when Shedeur Sanders, protected up front, trusted by his coach, and armed with a receiver he can genuinely rely on, starts to play the game the way he was born to play it. Though I genuinely want to hear where you stand on this, because the Tyreek argument is not nothing. Drop it in the comments. Tyreek Hill or Amon-Ra St. Brown? Which one fits the vision better? Which one makes Cleveland the team nobody wants to play in January? Because both of them represent a genuine upgrade for this offense, and the discussion matters because it gets to the heart of what Cleveland is building and who it's being built for. Let's talk about the full picture now, the complete image of what Cleveland is assembling, because when you lay all of these pieces next to each other, something comes into focus that I don't think most people outside of Ohio are fully seeing yet. A head coach who is committed fully to his quarterback, a quarterback with the processing speed, the poise, and the football intelligence to absorb the demands of an NFL offense at a younger age than most. A line being rebuilt specifically around the way that quarterback moves and operates. A backup with elite quarterback IQ who, if he's bought in the way it appears he has, becomes one of the most valuable developmental resources in the entire league. A potential receiver addition that fits the specific kind of chemistry-first approach this offensive environment requires, and anchoring the whole thing on the other side of the ball, Myles Garrett, one of the most dominant defensive players in the league, who has publicly said he believes in where this team is headed. Think about what that last part means coming from him. Garrett has been in Cleveland through years of organizational dysfunction, through coaching changes and roster shuffles, and the particular frustration of being one of the best players at your position in the league and playing for a team that can't build the other pieces around you. When a player of his stature, with his experience, with his earned right to be skeptical after everything he's seen in that building, says publicly that he believes in where this is headed, you listen. That is not a quote generated for the media availability. That is a football player who has seen something real enough to put his credibility behind it. What Cleveland is building is not a patchwork roster held together by veteran leadership that already peaked and expensive contracts that were meant to buy championships rather than develop them. What Cleveland is building is a coherent, connected, thoughtfully constructed team where every piece was selected with a specific purpose in mind, and that purpose connects back to the quarterback at the center of the whole design. A young quarterback who is being given an environment that can actually unlock his potential. A line built to protect him, a coach built to develop him, a veteran behind him that can accelerate his growth, a receiver situation that serves his development first, a defense that can keep games winnable while the offense finds its legs.
That is a real foundation, not a metaphorical foundation in the sense of we're building for the future and hoping something eventually clicks. A real, structural, brick-by-brick foundation, where the mortar between the bricks is organizational alignment rather than internal tension. The kind of foundation that doesn't crumble after a bad loss in November. The kind that gets stronger as the season progresses, because every hard experience becomes a data point that the team uses to improve, rather than a wound that festers and divides. The difference between a team built that way and a team that is just talented on paper without any coherent connective tissue is not visible in week 1. It becomes visible in weeks 11, 12, 13, when the season is long and the legs are tired and the schedule is hard and the losses have started to accumulate and the outside noise is at its loudest. Teams with real foundations get better in those weeks. Teams that were just talented on paper start to unravel. And Cleveland, for the first time in recent memory, is building the kind of team that gets better in those weeks. There's one piece still left to fall into place, and it's the piece that could either validate everything being built or introduce the final variable of uncertainty into an otherwise increasingly clear picture. Jimmy Haslam. Ownership buy-in is the final lock that needs to turn. And in the NFL, partial ownership buy-in is almost as bad as no ownership buy-in, because the moment an owner starts second-guessing the decisions of his coaching staff or his front office based on outside noise or pressure or impatience, the whole alignment that everyone worked to build begins to fracture in ways that are immediately felt inside the building, even if they're not immediately visible from outside it. What we're hearing is that the work is underway. The case is being made, urgently and with evidence. The coaching staff is bringing Haslam the full picture, not just the narrative, not just the feeling, but the actual substantive evidence of what Shedeur Sanders has shown in practice, in meetings, in the small moments that define a quarterback's character before the games even start. They are making the case that this isn't faith-based anymore, this is evidence-based. The proof is in what they've watched with their own eyes in real time in their own building, and that proof points clearly and without ambiguity to one conclusion: Shedeur Sanders is the answer. And what I genuinely believe is that when Haslam sees the complete picture, when he sits down with the full weight of everything the coaching staff has observed, and everything the front office is committed, and everything the draft class represents, and everything the locker room is feeling, he is going to reach the only logical conclusion available to a smart owner who is serious about winning. He is going to go all in, not because someone pressured him, not because the public narrative pushed him there, but because the evidence is overwhelming and the moment is real. And the window, which for so long has felt like it would never properly open for this franchise, is finally swinging wide open in front of him.
When that happens, when Haslam's full commitment joins the alignment that is already building throughout the rest of the organization, Cleveland will have done something genuinely rare in modern NFL history. They will have achieved complete organizational clarity at the most important position in professional sports. No competing narratives, no split loyalties at the top, no quiet skepticism running alongside the public enthusiasm. Just one direction, one vision, one quarterback, and an entire building full of people from the owner's box to the equipment room, all pulling toward the same destination. That is when things get genuinely dangerous for the rest of the AFC. Let's be specific about why, because the AFC right now is not the kind of conference that hands out playoff spots to teams with potential and promises. It is a competition, a hard, physical, brutally competitive competition, where the margin between a team that makes it in January and a team that watches them from home is thin and unforgiving and never guaranteed. The teams that make it in January are not the teams with the best individual talent on paper. They are the teams that were built the most coherently, managed the most thoughtfully, and aligned the most completely around a quarterback who had everything he needed to operate at the highest level when it mattered most. That description fits what Cleveland is putting together right now. A coached-up, protected, fully supported Shedeur Sanders under center, an offensive line built specifically for the way he plays, a receiver room designed to serve his development and build genuine chemistry rather than just add raw talent for its own sake. Deshaun Watson behind him with a brain full of NFL-level knowledge and, if the framework holds, a genuine desire to pour that knowledge into the young quarterback in front of him. Myles Garrett on the other side of the ball, terrorizing offensive lines with the same relentless, otherworldly effectiveness he has brought to every single season of his professional career. And a coaching staff with a clear plan, a clear vision, and a clear commitment to the quarterback they've chosen to build it around.
Put all of that together on the same roster, in the same building, pointing in the same direction, and you do not have a feel-good story about a franchise that tried hard and came up short again. You have a problem. A real, legitimate keep defensive coordinators up on Saturday night problem. The kind of team that other organizations look at on their schedule and start scheming for 6 weeks in advance because they know if they're not prepared, something very bad is going to happen to them on game day. Cleveland could be that team this year. Not could be in the tentative, we'll see, maybe if everything breaks right sense that organizations use when they're trying to manage expectations downward. Could be in the genuine, legitimate, I have looked at the evidence and made my assessment sense of someone who has actually thought about this carefully and believes the ingredients are there to make it real. A playoff spot is no longer a hope. If these pieces come together the way they appear to be coming together, it is a realistic expectation. And a Super Bowl run? I know how that sounds. I know that sentence attached to the Cleveland Browns has historically been the punchline to a joke rather than the conclusion of a serious analysis. But the AFC is open. The hierarchy at the top is not locked. The path exists for a team that gets this right, that builds intelligently around a quarterback who has the talent and the temperament to take them there. And Cleveland, right now, today, is the team that looks most like a team that is getting this right. Here is the part of the story that I want to end on, because I think it gets lost sometimes in the roster analysis and the draft capital discussion and the coach speak about competition and development. It gets lost in the noise of the reporting and the reactions and the debate about which wide receiver fits better and whether Watson's ego will hold and whether Haslam will fully commit. Shedeur Sanders is a young man who has been tested. Not in the abstract, not in the way everyone who reaches this level has been tested by the demands of elite competition. Tested specifically and directly. He entered the NFL draft as one of the most discussed quarterback prospects in recent memory, and the discussion was not always kind. He watched his draft position become a story that existed almost entirely separate from his ability to play football. He watched the narrative around him get complicated by factors that had nothing to do with what he does between the white lines.
He walked into a situation where the expectations are enormous, the patience is short, and the history of the franchise he's joining provides very little reason for unconditional optimism. And through it all, every single step of it, he kept showing up, kept working, kept earning the respect of the coaches and teammates around him through what he does in the building every day, rather than through what he says to cameras or how he manages his public perception. Every test this process has put in front of him, he has passed. Every storm that has formed around him, he has navigated without losing his footing or his focus. Every day that has offered him a reason to doubt himself or disengage from the process, he has shown up anyway and done the work. That is the foundation of everything being built in Cleveland right now. Not just the draft picks and the receiver room and the offensive line and the coaching commitment, though all of those matter enormously. The foundation is a quarterback who at the very start of his professional career is already demonstrating the mental and emotional qualities that separate the ones who make it in this league from the ones who don't. The resilience, the consistency, the willingness to do the hard, unglamorous, largely invisible work that eventually produces something visible and undeniable on Sunday afternoons. The Cleveland Browns are closer to getting this right than they have been in years. Perhaps closer than they have ever been in the modern era of this franchise. The pieces are in place, the belief is building, the talent is arriving, the organizational alignment is forming around the quarterback they've chosen to build it all around. And right in the middle of it all is a young man who has already earned everything that's coming his way. All the organization has to do now is take the final step. Believe it fully, without reservation, without the 1 foot in and 1 foot out approach that has cost this franchise so much over so many years. In the NFL, half committed is the same as not committed at all. The window that is opening right now in Cleveland does not stay open forever. The conditions that are present right now, the right coach, the right quarterback, the right supporting cast beginning to form around him, are rare and fragile and do not come back around easily once they pass. Shedeur Sanders, go all in, build everything around him, remove the noise, remove the doubt, remove every last piece of the second guessing that has defined this franchise's relationship with the quarterback position for too long. And then let's finally find out, finally and definitively, what Cleveland can actually do when this organization decides to fully believe in its own future. Because from where I'm standing, watching everything that's happening in that building right now, the answer to that question is going to be something nobody outside of Cleveland was expecting. And I genuinely cannot wait for this season to begin.